Hello. So what we're going to do here, I'm going to show you the end result of this section. And again, the general idea here is we are going to change the app so that each individual user gets their own to-dos, and they can only possibly see their own, or create their own, or delete their own. So to illustrate just sort of the final result, I'm logged in right now as my Fred user, and I can see that I can create, right? I can delete, and of course I can read to-dos, right? And I see my to-dos are A, B, C. What I'm going to do now, let me log out. I already created a different user, Susie. So I'm going to log in. Now I'm going to log in with Susie user, which is a different user. So I'm showing you the end result first. And you can see now she has a different set of, she's not seeing the ABC, she's seeing her own set of to-dos. And of course she can create to-dos, but these are her to-dos. Okay, so and what we're going to do is we're going to walk through sort of what the changes were made to make this happen. So the first thing we want to look at is the structure of the table itself. So let me log into the console, show you sort of what the end result is around the table structure, and then I'll show you how I made the change. Let's see, this is DynamoDB. So that's the first change. This is a breaking change. So anyway, so the tables we have here, we have a to-dos, and previously our well, maybe to see if you just see the items themselves, it might be easier to see the structure of them. So the new structure is we now have the primary key for this table is actually a combination of a partition key and a sort key. So the primary key is now identity ID, which is, we'll see what this is. It's an identity of the user, right? So that's either Fred or Susie, right? And then the ID itself is just a unique ID just for sorting purposes. It has to be unique across users, right? And then the name itself, actually this is 0, so this is Susie's. So, and you can see in the data structure here, if you sort it here, I guess if I could sort, you can see that there's basically some are Susie's and some are Fred's. So, how that change was made, let me just show you how I did it. Again, the repo will be available in the story, right? Didn't need to make that big. CD documents. Let me make this bigger. So if I go to CD to-do RS, no, yeah, to-do RS backend, there's a file called scripts, right? So the first thing I did was, well, let's look at the script itself. Of course, now it's too small. Okay, so there's a script here. Now this script here I use for local development. See this -- endpoint URL? If I get rid of that line and I basically run this script with shell and then sh space create table local shell, this will actually create the table that I need. So now before you create the table, you need to delete it. So the command there is, I don't want to really do it here, but the command will be, you would do AWS, let me see, oop, I didn't mean to do this. It's very similar to this format. You would do AWS DynamoDB delete table -- table name to-dos. If you do that, that'll delete the table, right? Of course, it'll delete all your data, but this is just development. And then after you delete the table, you can just run shell create table shell, and then that'll create the table. Now, again, you'd before you did that, you would want to remove this last line because this bottom one basically points at the Docker version of the database, right? And if you look at this, you can see the table name, the attributes, that there's identity ID, an attribute of that. There's two different attributes, right? Identity ID, and the schema. The primary key is identity ID, and ID is the sort key. That's the range means that. And otherwise, it's basically the same as before. Okay, so that essentially that creates the table. Okay, so that's the first step. So now you got the table right. Now, once you change the table, your code's not going to run. So that's anyway, that is the way it is. So we deleted the table. We created the table. The next thing we need to do is, but before we look at the code, there's one other change we're going to have to make, and this has to do with creating an identity pool. So this is back into the console. Here we go back to Cognito, and I'll go through the exercise of creating a new one. I've already got the one that's running right now called example, so I'm going to create a new one. And identity pool, I'm going to create a new pool. I'm going to call my new pool to-dos are us. No, I'm going to just call it users. I think I am going to name it the same as, something. What did I name? Manage user pools. I'm going to call it the same as this. I have a user pool called customers, and I'm going to create my identity pool the same way, just for consistency. So let me go to Cognito, customers. Okay, so manage identity pools, create an identity pool, customers, okay? And we are not going to allow unauthenticated users. So everybody has to be authenticated. And we're not going to use this old classic flow. That's not recommended. And we do need to set up an authentication provider. And of course, I just closed my other window. We basically here now this needs to be pointing at our identity pool. So you can use all sorts of identity providers like Google and Amazon, but we are using our own user pool for this. So here that wants to know the pool ID. So you copy that and copy. And app client ID, we need to grab that from app client, this number here, and there. That's it. And then we create the pool. And so then, in addition to that, when you do this, this will actually create two new roles. And we're going to let that do that. And allow. And then you're it. That's it. So the pools are created. There's one more thing we need to do with the pool, though. So basically, I'm going to copy this from the existing one, and we'll bring it over. So in any access management, there is, well, let me just copy it, and we'll look at it. So one of the roles that I'm already currently using is this Cognito example auth role, right? And I have a policy here, and this is the JSON. Can I copy this? Oh, I can copy this. So I'm gonna copy this, and I'll just walk through basically what it is. Actually, I could just copy the whole thing. Gosh darn it. Give me a second. Okay, grab here. Okay, I'm really having trouble. Okay, well, I'll grab that. Copy that. Copy. Okay. So one of the new roles that got created should be Cognito customers. Here it is. So this auth role is basically, this is the role that when people are authorized, they essentially can take over this role. This is the role that they can assume. And this is the policy that was auto-generated, and it has some specifics around Cognito. But we want the user who uses the app to be able to write to certain DynamoDB tables, right, or one table. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit this policy and use JSON. And this is pretty close to right, except for, I think I want to come in here. Let me come down below. I didn't copy everything. Let's see. So let's see, version. It looks like if I just put a bracket here, get rid of this, I end up with the valid. Okay, so basically this is what it was before, the same thing, but I've added in allowing putting, deleting, and querying DynamoDB to-dos table. And then the secret here is also, but it's only for basically the current, the leading key, which is basically the partition key, right? Basically that's what this is, saying the partition key has to be the same thing as the subscriber's ID. So whoever's logged in, whenever they assume this role, they can only edit their own records, is essentially what this means. Okay, so a little bit of trickery there. Review policy. Save changes. So essentially now this role, the code will look at it, will basically allow me to take over this role, and then when the code runs, it's running with the person's permissions, and they can only then edit their own stuff. So that's the next thing. So now we should look at the code in question. So the code in question is somewhere different. So it's only going to be changes to the back end, because the front end essentially isn't, interact exactly the same. This is all about how the data is being stored. And I'm just going to walk you through the main changes here. The first set of changes is there is an environments file, settings, okay? And this is for like local development, and then these same environment variables need to be set. We'll look at where that gets changed when we try to push this to production or onto the server. But there's a couple things that our code needs now to do this assuming of permission or assuming the roles. It needs your app account ID, and you basically have to go to your, you have to log in a root account, and then you have to go under your identity up the top right and say, actually what you do is I'm not going to go through the whole exercise, but if you go under here within a root account and say my account, you can find it there. The app audience, that is the, see number right, see the app audience, I think we did that, that was from before actually, it's not new. What's new is this app identity pool ID, and then there's app identity provider name. So the provider name is, well, let's see where all these come from. There's an app issuer. I can't remember where all these, I believe these three are new. No, actually, no, it's only these. The account ID is new, and so is the app identity pool and app provider. So the identity pool ID, you can get that from, where that's coming from is, if you go to Cognito, you go to manage entity pools. Now, this case, I'm still using the example one. I'll switch it later. But the identity pool number is I think it hit edit. There it is, ID. Yeah, so that's identity pool ID. And in the code, I'm asking for identity pool ID, right? And then app identity provider name, that is this line. And that is, let's see if I can figure where that's at. That's coming from this identity providers. Oh, right. So the pool ID is this. And if you look at the format of this, where's the code? The format is, it's always Cognito, IDP, the region, and then it's followed by the identity, the user pool ID right here. So that's where how that's constructed, right? And everything else is something from before. So that's the first change. You have to get these environment variables set up because the code needs to use that to do this adopting your role. Now, again, I'm not going through all the changes here, but the big changes here is you have to use environment variables, right? That's what a lot of code changes there look like. And then the database itself, well, let's look through this. Your authentication code, I've added some more stuff here. Essentially, you'll notice here, the first step is, you have to basically validate that the token is valid. That's already being done probably up here, right? And now I've added some more checks. After that, I basically now use Cognito identity, and I look up, basically, given the token, I have to look up the user, not pool, but user identity ID. That's what this basically does. This gets the ID. And once I get the ID, I get the credentials, and that's basically picking up these access key, secret key, and session token. And that's basically the credentials of the person who's logged in, and then their credentials are tied to that role that we looked at earlier. So their credentials basically only have that role, and that role has the ability to write to their database, that table, but only records that have their primary keys. So this is a little bit complicated. And then what I do is I basically initialize a database connection with these, and you'll notice that here basically it's, if I'm running in production, which is the bottom section, right, uses those keys, and so this DynamoDB connection resource now has the credentials of the user essentially, and then I use the tables from there. So when I do my table operations below, I'm actually operating with the credentials of the person who's actually using the app, right, to push these changes, and means that no matter what happens in this code, they can only write to their own entries. So that even if there's a bug in this code, it would still only have the ability to write to their own records. Okay, that's basically the code. Now the only other change is, that's the code, and then the last change is would need to remove, so I'm going to go in here and do this. If I go back into, previously, if you remember, which I barely remember to be honest, is we actually had a role. Okay, I'm going to pause the video. I've got a call real quick, so give me a second. We had a role, if I can find it. Oh, the task. So previously, the ECS tasks were running with this role, and we'll still leave the role here. But if you look at the role, the policy for this role was basically they could put, delete, and scan. They could basically put, delete, and scan, but they could do it on any entries in the table, right? So that's how previously that code we just looked at would actually run with this policy, and that's how people were writing. But that allowed that code to write to any record. So what we're going to do is actually detach this policy. We'll leave the role here in case we need it for something else, right? But now, when by default, those ECS roles are not getting any permissions at all from just the role. The only permissions that are getting is if somehow we're assuming the role of the user's logged in. And you'll notice even with this permission turned off, just to validate this, that Susie here still can create, right, and delete, and still read, right, because she's not now relying on that other role. I just deleted the role, the permissions I just deleted. She's still now using her own permissions. Okay, so I know there's a lot of stuff in here, and is what it is. But the main gist here was, the key here was we basically switched up the code to use the identity pool, right? which is different than user pool. Identity pool, which what allowed us to basically now lock down the back-end code based on permissions that we can assume the role that for that user, and that only allows that user to edit their own stuff. So that was kind of the main point. A bit complicated, a bit of code, but that's the main gist of it.